first I will talk a little bit, so this will go to the recordings, about the fact that we need to think about historical sources when we build network data. So this will be all about source criticism. Then we'll talk together, hopefully. So if you have questions or comments on the lecture, also if something was unclear and so on, I suggest that you keep it for after the lecture so that I can see you and look at the chat more easily. And I will offer experimentations on actual sources. I think only one of you sent me an example of a source and she could not attend, but feel free if the discussion makes you think about your own research to share your source, either by sending a link in the chat if the source is online, or I think we can arrange for you to be able to share your screen. So we'll do this one time, and then we'll do this another time. I will talk for 10 more minutes, more or less alone, about data formats. So the actual practical building of network data from sources. And then we will again have something like 25 minutes to discuss together and talk about your sources or sources that I found online if yours are not available. So that's the general structure for this lecture. And so the first part, the first lecture of this workshop, so the general topic of the workshop is from historical source to network data. How do we go from one to the other? And the first lecture will be concentrated on our reading of the source. The idea that we need to think a lot about historical sources if we want to build better network data. And it's something that I have tried to address a little bit in a forthcoming chapter that you had access to, and you can read it afterwards, of course. But maybe, of course, I don't know everything, but I saw a few explicit discussions of this step of research in the literature of networks. And I think it's really worth thinking about together, either if you are going to begin network research or if you are already seasoned practitioners, actually. So I will begin with some preliminary warnings that came actually to me from things I heard in previous workshops or trainings. And quite often I encountered colleagues who thought that network analysis software would be able to find network data in a source. As in, you input a source, digitized, of course, and a network pops up, possibly a big ball of hair, but some sort of network data. And it's quite common, this idea that there is something somewhere that might help me find networks or ties in my source. And it might sound silly, but it's not silly, actually. It's interesting to think of where this idea comes from. But anyway, network software won't find data in the source. And the nice thing about it is that you don't need specific software if you are a beginner in network analysis. You don't need specific software to build your data. You just need really your brains and very simple software such as a spreadsheet editor. And that's what I will address in the second short lecture. The good thing also, but the more time-consuming thing is, as there is no specific software and there are no standardized methods to extract network data from sources, it means that basically the building of network data relies on close reading and source criticism, as does any type of historical research. But you need to spend a lot of time at this stage of research building data from a close reading of your source if you want to get network data that makes sense and that brings something new to the analysis. So that's what I will focus on today. The second thing that I want to really say from the beginning, because I have seen a lot of misunderstandings, is that network data is basically a peculiar sort of data format, the type of data you need if you want to draw a network, the type of data you need to feed in network software. but it's not related to a specific part of historical reality. And that's one of the reasons why software cannot find networks in a source for you, is because anything really can be looked at as a network. Network analysis is not the analysis of a peculiar part of reality that would be friendship ties, marriage ties, commercial ties, because anything really can be looked at as a tie. Anything can be viewed as a network. Network research or network analysis is not research on networks as if networks were a peculiar part of reality. I don't know, like the economic realm as opposed to the cultural realm. Network research is more like an approach, a lens that you can apply to just anything. Think of gender. For me, the comparison makes sense. You can do gender research on anything. You can do network research on anything. So anything can be viewed as a network, even though some things are more interesting than others, arguably when viewed as a network. If what you study is a collection of isolated individuals, you can always draw a network and compute indicators, but it won't be super interesting, of course. If what you study is a group where you know that everybody has a relationship with everybody, it's not super interesting to draw a network or calculate network indicators because it's obvious. If what you study is basically a list, as in the list of people one author sends letters to, you can also draw a network. It will be a star, but you won't learn much. So basically things get interesting where you have a more complicated structure. And I think you'll see a little bit more of this with Martin if some of you stay later on the basics of network analysis. So arguably there are phenomena that are more interesting to think of in terms of networks because the structure is not obvious. But this encompasses a lot of reality still. So as anything can be viewed as a network, the good news is we can be creative. We don't have to confine ourselves to what I call the usual suspects, meaning the sources in history that have often been used in historical network research, or the types of ties, the types of relationships that have often been analyzed through social network analysis. Among the usual suspects, you have citation studies, you have board memberships, possibly alliances between families, correspondence. But there are many, many other things in social life that can be thought of as relationships. And here I just put a list in French, but you can see it's always starting with A. And it's colleagues who had endeavored to list all the different types of relationships that they could find in sources about early modern South America. And so it's just the beginning, it's A, it's part of A, but you see all the different types of relationships beginning with A that they found. So it's infinite, really, it's open to historical imagination. So we can be creative, as anything can be called a tie, and we have to be specific about which ties actually we study, because we cannot study all the ties that are present in a source. It's not infinite, but it's too much. So we should be specific, and this I will elaborate on more in the second lecture. And we should think really about which ties we study, and we should think about who says that there was a tie. And that's where source criticism enters, of course. And I'm just giving you an example of colleagues. They are sociologists, but they work on kind of historical sources, who studied different views on contemporary poetry. So it's the ego network of one poet as seen by another poet. And the interesting thing about this map is the map would be different if it were drawn from a different source, from a different poet talking about the same relationships. So the questions we have to ask when we build network data from sources are first and foremost, as for any kind of analysis of historical source, really, why do I find traces of past ties in this source? And it's always some past ties, not all the ties I'm interested in left traces in a source, in a written source, in an image or wherever, an inscription. And so the complement is what is missing is always something that we want to have in mind, especially because in network analysis, Martin will perhaps tell you about this, that results depend a lot on non-ties. You see here, there is kind of a structure. Some individuals are isolated. We have a group here. And the structure comes from the fact that there is no tie here, no tie there, no tie there, and so on. So missing information is a problem, as always, because the structure comes from the missing ties. So the first thing we have to think about when looking at a source is probably what's missing, what was not recorded in this source. And during the last 2 minutes, I just try to give you a tentative typology of historical sources regarding the types of ties that they document and the types of questions that we should ask. It's a bit abstract, but my hope is that during the discussion, we will fill this in with examples from your own research. And the typology is the thing that the typology I presented in the forthcoming chapter on historical and archaeological sources. So a first type of source that's often interesting in terms of production of network data is sources that were created to certify a tie, to make it official with some authority. For example, marriage records, records of economic exchanges, sometimes certificates of collaborations, inscriptions in archaeology. And of course, one of the questions is, okay, this is supposed to list all the marriages, but all the marriages, for example, as defined by who? And who had access to this, who had not, who did want to go there to get a certificate, who did not, and so on. But basically, the idea is we got a source on a tie because somebody wanted this tie to be recorded, actually, to be certified. A different type of source is what I call narratives on ties. And a famous example is letters, where you study not the fact that someone writes to someone, but you study the contents of the letters, what is said about the relationship of other people in the letters. And of course, we want to know whose worldview we are observing. We want to understand what was the intention of the author, because it's not the network. There is no absolute network here. It's one point of view on a network. A third type of source that has been quite often used in quantitative analysis of network, because it's arguably easier to quantify, to transform into data and to quantify, is lists of people. For example, the boards of corporations, the boards of associations. And so we transform this into networks of co-membership. The network is the fact that people were in the same association or that associations share members. But what we want to know is, was it the list of everybody who could have been left out? And also what it meant for the individuals to be included in this list together. Is it a proxy of some sort of relationship, as social scientists often use the word proxy? What kind of relationship does it indicate? The first type of source is just text, as in we study the co-occurrence of words in text. And in fact, part of texturometry, the formal study of text, can be performed using network analysis. So we discuss the fact that words come together in this text. We want to be specific on which version of the text we use, and we want to make hypotheses on why this co-occurrence of words matters for historical research. And finally, in the paper that's intended for the chapter that's intended for archaeologists, I discussed the fact that sometimes you use data built by previous researchers and put all of it together. And of course, you also need to perform source criticism in this case, but I won't give many details unless some of you are actually doing this. It's as common in history. So the message really is, in each case, what we want to do when we create network data is not create a database with as many ties as possible. The analysis will not be more interesting if we have more numerous ties, but we want to specify what counts as a tie. And this will allow us to compare structures across types of ties, periods, places, and even across sources. But this is actually leading to lecture 2, and I've been a bit long already. So I will stop there for lecture 1 and discuss with you if you have questions or comments on what I said. And if questions are slow to come, what I think we could do is look together at some sources. So once again, if you have sources of your own, by all means, show them to us. Or I can find sources on the web. And the second short lecture is really more focused on actual data formats and what you need to ultimately be able to use network analysis software to draw graphs or to calculate indicators. But I won't go into software a lot. It's about formats. And what I will advocate is the building of dense data, which some colleagues might call dirty, as opposed to tidy or clean data, as a first important step of research. And I give you the advice in advance to read before or after the workshop a blog post by Martin, which is also a tutorial actually on software, but from an example in his PhD research, nicely explains the actual practical building of network data. So what do I need to build network data? Oh, I got one slide, no problem. First, I need rows and columns. So it's not a big deal in terms of technology. You need anything that allows you to create rows and columns. So personally, I use a spreadsheet editor, Excel or Calc. You can use anything, even paper and pencil, but at some point you'll have to copy this into a computer. But you don't need a complicated data structure. You don't need relational databases. You can use one if you have one. You don't need anything specific. And the one rule, and then you can stop listening actually, is that network analysis software will all accept a format that is a list of ties. And so the golden rule is 1 row per tie, which is not obvious or intuitive if you have never done network research, because quite often our databases or spreadsheets are organized by individual. The historians often study persons, or by source, by book, by picture, work of art, etc. So the unit that we study generally is not spontaneously a tie. But if you put information on ties in bases that are structures or individuals or books, etc., it makes things more complicated. So at some point, if you want to perform network analysis, you have to create manually or semi-automatically something that's organized with 1 row per tie. In fact, following what I said before about the layers and the different views that different sources can give at the same time, it's 1 row per mention of a specific tie in a source. And I will elaborate a little bit on this. So what do I mean by 1 row per tie, or in fact, 1 row per mention of a specific tie? Take the example of a correspondence from the beginning, to begin with. Well, if I have information that A wrote to B and C, not A, sorry, that A wrote to B and C, that's 2 rows, in the sense that I don't have 1 row organized around the sender and all the receivers afterwards. I want 1 row per receiver. That's, I think, quite easy to understand. What begins to be more interesting is we want 1 row per tie, in the sense that if A wrote to B and A was B's co-author, for example, or friend, or whatever, we want 2 rows discussing the fact that the 2 same individuals had 1 type of relationship and also another type of relationship. We could put all this in 1 row, but believe me, it would become cumbersome at some point. So it's easier in terms of format to have two separate rows for two different relationships between the same individuals. And then what happens if I have information that A wrote to B twice or 10 times? Well, it's easier if you put information on different rows too. So, of course, at some point you might want to aggregate this and say writing relationship intensity 2 or 10. But if you want to keep information, for example, on the dates of these letters or the locations from where they were sent, it will become cumbersome. So you keep the information disaggregated. And if there's the same relationship 2 times, it's not the same relationship. It's 2 different ties because it's 2 different moments. And finally, if I find 2 different sources that mention that A was a friend with B, for example, it's also better to keep 2 separate rows because then it's easier to keep the details on the sources. And at some point you can decide, okay, I draw graphs and calculate indicators according to this source as compared to this other source, which you cannot do or not easily if you put all this together in one row. So you end up with many rows because you disaggregate information, and each row is really a relational atom, really a small unit, and quite a lot of columns too, actually. Because once I have defined a row, as I did it on the slide before, what do I want to know about each of these ties? Well, they are specific because each tie has a specific couple of sender and receiver. If it's a different receiver, we go to another row. We said we wanted the type of tie because we would have one row for sending a letter, another for being a co-author, another for being a friend. We want to specify the source because we want to be able to exclude some sources from some parts of the analysis. And this, we want the date of the tie. I mentioned the fact that if a tie is repeated, maybe at some point we want to study what happened in one decade as opposed to another decade. So if we put the date in a specific column, it's just easier to subtract information afterwards. And quite often, it's interesting to have a column about the location of the tie, if it makes sense. Sometimes some types of ties do not have a location, but think of the sale of land. 2 people may, one person might buy land in a place where they do not live, and the seller might not live there either, but the location of the sale is sometimes. So it's already quite a lot of columns. You can see a variant of this in Martin's post about his dissertation, with a focus on dates and duration, less so on locations. It depends, of course, on your topic, but it's good to think of all these basics. Sometimes, of course, you don't have this information in your source, or you think you don't care, but, well, things you think you don't care about often come back to haunt you afterwards. So think that you could possibly want to fill in all these columns for each time. And in fact, it's not like 6 or 7 columns because each of these pieces of information has smaller pieces in it, and you want to disaggregate information in your database. So for example, you will often want to know attributes of the nodes in your network. That is information on the sender and receiver. I gave examples here. If the nodes are human beings, the type of information might be different if the nodes are books or companies. But the general idea is you want as much information as you can get. And quite often, well, you will tell me why not store this in a different database or spreadsheet. And the answer is all this information might change over time, or might be differently recorded in different sources. So that a lot of this information is actually relative to the tie, and you can store it in the same place. But anyway, you want a lot of details on the source, as I said to Nathan. Is there an author to each entry? Is there a date? Is there a place of writing, etc.? Because you might want to differentiate according to these variables afterwards. And as for the date of the tie, you could want a beginning and a duration. So if you end up with dozens of columns describing a source that seemed simple at first glance, it's normal, and it's a good sign, actually, that you will be able to make the most out of this very dense information. And I just put an example, it's in French, but from an actual data set in progress by a doctoral student who studies the minutes of a vegetarian society. And she studies citation in the sense of, during the discussions, the members of the society mention people from the society and people from outside for a lot of reasons, really, and that's what she wants to investigate. They mention doctors, they mention ancient thinkers from the antiquity, they mention politicians, and this seems simple enough. Basically, she reads the minutes and she focuses on names of individuals, and there are a lot of columns already about the source, the details on each person, and quotations about the way the person is mentioned. And that's one of the things I put here, is the idea of keeping information in the words of the source as far as possible. So keeping, for example, for the type of ties, if it's in letters, it's not standardized, keep the information in the language of the source as to what type of ties we are talking about. And so why so much information, why so many details, is not just to bother you. It's because, as I said already, there's not just one network in the source, there are many possible views of a network. And we will want to abstract things, to subtract things from the network quite often, as to be able to understand its structure. And that's why I put the example by Rosie. And the other thing, on the last idea here, so why keep so much detail? Of course, the dirty, dense version of the data set at some point with all the quotations from the source, it will not be directly the thing that you import in network software. You will have to have a simpler version that you can call clean or abstract, just simpler. But the thing is, and Martin put it beautifully, is you have to adapt your coding scheme frequently and brace yourself for recording your data a few times during research, even if it's not a PhD dissertation. And what is very dirty in some ways, way to input data that I advocate allows you to, is to experiment in the sense of categorizing your data in different ways. And to sum up visually, this is an example that's not from network data, but it's something Claire and I advocate for all sorts of data. So you begin with your source, you create a dirty data set in the sense that it has many, many columns with a lot of information in the language of the source, comments and so on, but it's structured already. And then you simplify this, you create exclusive categories, you have a coding scheme, and then you end up with a simpler table that you put, for example, in network software. But the fact that these two phases are not confused in one, the fact that the first data set has many columns with a lot of details, allows you to go through different categorization phases, focusing on different things, simplifying in different ways. And so it allows you trial and error, which is always good for research. So that's what I wanted to show you very briefly about actual formats of network data. And I haven't given you, silly me, the link to the slides, but if you want to download the presentation, I put it in the chat now. Okay. You can download the slides that are ugly, as you could see, but maybe some could be useful. And really, I think the key slides are those about when should I create a row in the list of ties, and questions to ask about ties and possible columns in a data set. And that really, in my experience, has worked with colleagues who wanted to create data sets on network data from historical sources. So that's for lecture 2, and we still